In December 1978, an Italian security guard would have one of the strangest alien encounters in the history of his country. In time, the man would allege he had been abducted by aliens at least 11 times. While the case sounds too far-fetched to be true, there is a surprising amount of circumstantial evidence to support this man's claims. There was physical evidence found at the scene, as well as testimony from people in the area on several occasions. His initial case garnered widespread media attention in Italy at the time, prompting media around the country to investigate. Soon, he would undergo hypnosis on live television with hundreds of thousands watching. The strange events around this man became quite controversial, and we will soon come to know why. In this episode, we will explore this unbelievable case, the story of Pier Zanfretta, and several of his alien abductions. On the night of December 6, 1978, security guard Pier Zanfretta was driving in inclement weather toward the home of a client, Dr. Utsuro. The home was located in Torriglia, which is located around 20 kilometers northeast of Genoa. Around 11:30 p.m., Pier Zanfretta's life would change forever. As he arrived at the home, suddenly his car lost power. He looked out his window into the garden of the home and saw 4 strange lights. He believed it was thieves, so Zanfretta got out of his car and snuck into the garden quietly, hoping to surprise the trespassers. As he headed in, he walked next to a rock wall, hoping to stay hidden. Then, Zanfretta felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around expecting to see one of the burglars, but instead was greeted with the sight of some sort of hideous monster. Zanfretta would later describe the being as huge, at least 10 feet tall. He said it had wrinkled, greenish skin with large yellow triangular eyes and red veins across its forehead. It was also wearing something that resembled a tunic. He said the creature was hideous and repulsive. A terrified Zanfretta ran back toward his vehicle. Right as he was about to approach it, though, a bright light lit up the area. He glanced behind him and saw a massive, triangular-shaped craft. Zanfretta was blinded, but also bewildered. He couldn't get over the size of the craft, which was bigger than Dr. Rigi's home. Zanfretta then stated something hit him, some sort of heat beam, which incapacitated him. Despite this, Zanfretta, at 12:15 a.m., was able to stumble to his car and radio his superiors. Carlo Tocolino would take the call and later testify that much of the conversation was garbled. Also, when they did communicate, Zanfretta seemed terrified and was acting hysterical, leading Tocolino to believe foul play was involved and he was being assaulted. Still, it wasn't clear what was happening. For instance, Tocolino would ask who was attacking him, and Zanfretta said, "No, they aren't men. They aren't men. My God, are they ugly?" Communications then suddenly stopped, and Tocolino escalated the situation to his superiors. Another patrol was sent out. However, with the roads so icy, it would take an hour for them to arrive. 2 patrol officers, Walter Loria and Raimondo Maschia, arrived to the scene and found Zanfretta. He was lying right in front of the home on the freezing ground. When Zanfretta first spotted the security guards, he hopped up and pointed his gun at them. The 2 security guards identified themselves, but Zanfretta seemed out of it. He didn't recognize them and was acting extremely unusual. This was very strange, as Zanfretta was usually reserved and shy. His colleagues described him as a loving family man. With no other choice, the 2 guards bum-rushed Zanfretta and disarmed him. As they tackled him, they couldn't believe just how warm his body was. This made no sense, since it was freezing outside. That night, the matter would reach the Italian police force, and they would help with the investigation. They arrived on the scene, and they would soon discover something to lend support to Zanfretta's story. The grass was covered with frost that night. Behind the home, the police found 2 large indentations. They were around 9 feet in diameter and resembled horseshoes. Most notably, though, something had penetrated the frost-covered grass that night. Something heavy. Most speculate these marks came from the landing gear of the UFO. As word spread about the event, it shook the community. Pier Zanfretta was a level-headed family man, known for his integrity and honesty. Still, eventually the press got a hold of the story, and stories spread across the country around the incident. Most ridiculed him, although some looked for other explanations. One reporter that would become interested in the case was Rino Di Stefano, a journalist from Genoa who wanted to investigate the case. Unlike many of his colleagues, the case didn't make sense to him. He pondered why this family man with a good career would risk everything. In addition, over 50 residents in the area would report seeing a bright light in the direction of the site that night. They all confirmed the strange lights occurred around midnight. After several conversations with Zanfretta, Stefano would also observe just how shy he was. He certainly didn't want to be in the limelight and had been getting harassed over his story. Stefano wanted to uncover what happened to Zanfretta when he was unconscious. He suggested meeting with Dr. Mauro Moretti, a psychotherapist and member of the Italian Association of Medical Hypnosis. Dr. Moretti would perform the hypnosis, and we would learn the following in the sessions. Once under, Zanfretta alleged the hideous beings abducted him and took him someplace, which was very hot. There, they interrogated him and probed him. The beings used some sort of voice box to communicate with him. It translated whatever they were saying into Italian. The creatures would inform Zanfretta they were from a planet called Titiona. Perhaps most terrifying, the beings would tell him they would come back one day with more of their species. While this revelation was terrifying enough for Zanfretta, 3 days later he would have another horrifying abduction. Just 3 days after his hypnotic session, Zanfretta was taken again. This story is pretty incredible as well. Zanfretta claimed that he was driving his car through the Barbaglia tunnel near the Scofera Pass. Then suddenly something took control of his car. Zanfretta was panicked and radioed in his car that it was actually driving by itself. The car exited the tunnel and Zanfretta tried to brake or take control of the car. The car would go about a mile, and then once again a bright white light illuminated everything around him. He would be discovered around 1 a.m. in the morning once again. The scene was extremely strange. Sergeant Emanuele Travanzoli would find Zanfretta in a field down the road. It was pouring rain outside, yet when Travanzoli touched Zanfretta, he was warm, just like last time. His clothes were also remarkably dry. Zanfretta was said to be shaking in fear and sobbing. Perhaps even more perplexing was the conditions of the car. The top of the car was blazing hot as if it had been sitting in the sun. The officer would open the door and it was scorching hot inside. One would even describe it as the same temperature as an oven. Again, it was raining and winter at this time. Zanfretta was a mess. As the officer spoke with him, he kept saying, "They say I must leave with them. What about my children? I don't want to. I don't want to." More indentations were found at the scene too. This time though, they appeared to be footprints. His car, a Fiat, had boot prints all around it. They were massive, measuring 20 inches and about 8 inches wide. This was documented by the Italian police and remains one of the critical pieces of evidence for Zanfretta's claims. One other strange thing that happened that night was Zanfretta fired his weapon 5 times, although he can't remember discharging it. With so much criticism, and to prove he wasn't lying, Zanfretta agreed to go under hypnosis once again. This time though, the event would be televised. Hundreds of thousands watched, and during the televised event, Zanfretta would recall wearing a helmet that allowed him to communicate with them. The event was not perceived well with the public. Many believed he was lying and fabricated the whole event. A third alleged alien abduction occurred on July 30th, 1979. That night, Zanfretta would be on his motorcycle patrolling when he was taken. Zanfretta would undergo hypnosis once more. This time, though, to prove he was telling the truth, at his request, he was injected with sodium pentothal, or a truth serum. Once the truth serum kicked in, Zanfretta claims he was lifted up by a green light and entered a UFO. The truth serum gave more credibility for Zanfretta. Many experts would say it's almost impossible to lie under a truth serum. Zanfretta would go on to have more abductions and encounters. On one occasion, a man approached him at a gas station. The strange-looking man told Zanfretta to drive into a nearby cloud. Zanfretta recalled that for some reason, he obeyed the commands as if they were controlling his mind. On one other occasion, Zanfretta was taken. 4 security guards, upon approaching the area, would spot a mysterious cloud in the sky. It shot a beam of light at their car, and one of the men saw something he couldn't forget. Sadly, he would commit suicide just months later. What can we make of Pierre Zanfretta's alleged alien encounters and abductions? It's certainly an interesting one and controversial. First off, it's odd to get a case with such strange claims that seem to have some credible support. Usually, very strange cases are just one eyewitness and often only supported by hypnosis. It appears Zanfretta encountered an alien type known as reptoids, or the reptilians. These are usually widely dismissed outside UFO circles and are considered to be just conspiracy theory. Most alien abductee reports involve gray aliens or Nordics. While this case feels too strange to be true, it has an enormous amount of circumstantial evidence. On the first occasion, physical evidence was found at the scene, as well as Zanfretta's body was warm. In addition, over 50 people saw a white bright light that night. On the second abduction, there was quite a bit of physical evidence at the scene, including the hot car and a dry, warm Zanfretta. On the third case, Zanfretta alleged to be abducted under a truth serum, which is pretty difficult, maybe impossible to do. In total, there were at least 60 witnesses who claimed to have seen strange, unexplainable evidence or witnessed the bright light or craft. One man was so traumatized that sadly he chose to take his own life. Still, many speculate this was all a charade by Zanfretta. Many say that an ambitious journalist, Stefano, teamed up with Zanfretta to perpetrate the lie. Were all the details accurate from the first abduction? Perhaps a truth serum was never injected. Many questions have swirled around this case, including the credibility of the hypnosis sessions and whether we should even trust these. In addition, Zanfretta was supposed to be shy and timid, but why was he giving so many interviews and going on live television? It appears this case has no easy answers and will continue to remain controversial. Some of the best types of UFO cases involve sightings with many witnesses. While much more rare than UFO sightings with 1 or 2 witnesses, reports with a large number are taken much more seriously, even by skeptics. In Japan, in the early 19th century, a strange ship washed ashore on the beach. The incident was seen by many, and perhaps more importantly, was documented in various Japanese writings. Since then, it has led many to research and ask, what was this craft? And perhaps more importantly, who was the strange woman inside it? In this episode, we will investigate this Japanese incident, a case that came to be known as Utsuro Bune, or the Hollow Ship Story. On February 22, 1803, several men were fishing just off the shores of Hariadoria Beach in the Hitachi region when they would spot a strange boat in the waves. The men noticed the ship wasn't big and decided to tow it back to shore. As they brought it back, people began to gather on the beach, wondering just what it was. Once it was ashore, they were able to observe the strange craft in more detail. It had a dome-like top that was colored dark red. The bottom was dome-shaped too, although more elongated, and was covered with something that resembled brass metal plates. The craft was around 11 feet tall and 18 feet wide, with windows covered by bars on the upper half. In general, it didn't look like anything that the fishermen nor anyone else had ever seen. What would happen next, though, would truly shock the onlookers. A young woman who appeared foreign and of European descent exited the craft. The woman was estimated to be around 5 feet tall. She had red hair and also had white hair extensions made of some type of fur. She appeared elegant and was wearing what appeared to be silk clothes. She also carried a box in front of her. The purpose of the box couldn't be ascertained by the Japanese citizens. All we know in regards to the box is that the woman was very protective over it and wouldn't let anyone touch it. The woman would begin speaking to the people. However, she wasn't speaking Japanese, and no one knew what she was trying to communicate. As a result, who she was and what she wanted was a complete mystery. As word reached the leader of the village, the town elder speculated that the woman might have been outcast from a foreign land because she had married against her father's will, or possibly she had cheated on her husband. At a crossroads, and not wanting to get drawn into a potential conflict if they helped her, the town elders decided to put her back in the ship and drag it out to sea. The strange boat was never seen again by the townspeople. Interestingly, this isn't the first time a case like this had happened in Japan during this time. Around the same time, sometime prior, there were reports of a strange ship similar in appearance washing up on a Japanese beach not too far away. In addition, a woman, similar to the one described, was on board the ship. Over the years, the story, and ones like it, have been examined by many due to the abundance of documents on the scene that day. In addition, there are other stories of hollow ships washing up around Japan during that time. Many of the details are very similar among the events. There's a number of documents that mention this story. In fact, several Japanese newspapers from the early 19th century tell very similar stories. These include Tales from the Rabbit Garden, published in 1825, Stories from Drifters, around 1835, and Dust of the Plume, from 1844. It's important to point out, too, that these are just several of the more well-known sources, as others exist too. This incident has been explored and has raised questions around what exactly the ship was and who was the woman. We know several things. This event seemed very likely to occur, as multiple sources have documented around Japan. In addition, we pretty much know this woman wasn't from Japan based on her description, and also the ship didn't appear to be Japanese. That said, there are traditional Japanese boats known as taira bune, which are circular, open log boats, but these are quite different than the descriptions of the hollow ship. Generally, there appears to be two main theories on who this woman was and what the ship was. The first is that the woman and ship were from some type of European country or other Western country. The description of the woman supports this theory. However, most of the facts around it don't make sense. If a woman was banished, it seems almost certain she would have died at sea, unless of course she was dropped off near the Sea of Japan. Also, by all accounts, the woman looked healthy. Was she dropped off with the intent to allow the Japanese to imprison her? Possibly, but this seems unlikely. This has led many to speculate and support the second theory. This is that the woman was an extraterrestrial and the craft somehow malfunctioned. It was reported there was strange writing inside it, and even though Japanese citizens wouldn't recognize English letters, it's a bit odd that there would be writing inside the craft. Some speculate that this was some sort of survival pod. It does bear a remarkable resemblance to the pods used by NASA astronauts when they return to Earth. Perhaps a craft malfunctioned mid-flight and the being jumped in this escape pod. The being description itself seems to support this theory too. She was said to be wearing expensive clothes and didn't appear to be unhealthy or malnourished. The last question in this story concerns what was the box. One thought is that it could have been some sort of tracking device and that it would help her to be found. Unfortunately, this case has no remaining physical evidence nor witnesses that can be interviewed. We do, though, have a treasure trove of documents indicating something strange washed up on the shore that day. Perhaps in time, we will discover another document that reveals more about this strange event and who exactly this woman was and what her ship was as well. For more than a decade, a young Canadian man would struggle with health issues and insomnia. The man was lost and couldn't quite seem to get his life together. Something was off, yet the man couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then one day the man picked up a copy of Bud Hopkins' book named Missing Time, and suddenly the man knew why he had been having problems. In this episode, we will explore this incredibly strange alien abduction from Canada, a case that has come to be known as the 1973 bandwagon alien abduction. Sometime in 1973, in Jordan, Ontario, 4 members of a Canadian band wrapped up a show at Alice's restaurant and began moving their instruments outside to their van. As they were packing it up, a strange man would approach the group and inquire whether he could grab a ride with them. The band didn't recognize the man, nor did they see him while they were playing their gig. Regardless, the band agreed to take the man, a decision that would haunt band member Thomas Campbell for years. While it's not certain that this person was not human, as we will see, all signs point to some sort of connection to the events that would happen to the band members. As the van pulled out of Alice's restaurant, the group began driving down a service road, with band member Guillaume driving and the drummer in shotgun. The other 2 band members, including Tom, were in the back with the strange man. It's not known specifically why they took this route, and we will discuss later perhaps they were subconsciously influenced. As they were driving down the road, though, the driver would suddenly spot strange lights up ahead. He didn't think too much of it at first, a common first impression when individuals first spot bright UFOs in desolate areas. However, as they drove closer, Guillaume would suddenly slam on the brakes. Thomas, who was in the back, would yell, "What's going on up there?" Guillaume responded, "I think you better come up here and take a look at this." The band members would all climb up, all except the strange man. There, the group were stunned to see a silver metallic craft blocking the road, and after some debate, decided to drive back to Alice's restaurant for the time. However, when Guillaume tried to turn the car around, he lost control of it. The car froze and then began hovering toward the craft a bit closer until it was around 30 feet away. While the frightened group watched in silence, the strange man sat in the back as if he knew this was going to happen, and perhaps even more frightening, he had led them there. As they looked upon the craft, a hatch opened up. The drummer would spot the beings, and they would exit the craft. As the men sat in the van, the beings walked to the side of the van, and the band members watched as the beings tried to open the side door, but with no luck. Tom would see one of the creatures head right by the window. At some point during this commotion, the strange man would open the back door, and the band would be stunned to see 4 beings. They had white grayish skin with large black eyes. The beings had only 3 fingers, all of which were quite long. The beings were short, being around 4 feet tall, and also, interestingly, were reported by Thomas to smell like aftershave. This is a detail which we will discuss later in the video. One of the beings who appeared to be the leader climbed in the van. It was dark and tough to make out details, but telepathically the alien communicated to the men it came in peace and not to be afraid. The being asked the crew if 3 of them would come with them so they could run some tests. The group communicated telepathically they would. As the being first climbed out of the van, it would knock off some musical equipment onto the ground. The frightened drummer assured the being, who Thomas called the captain, that the drummer was okay. When Thomas grabbed some recorders to bring on board, the other band members were terrified and couldn't understand why he was bringing it. The captain read their thoughts and assured them it was okay to bring. Thomas, along with the bassist and drummer, would exit the craft and follow the beings. They walked through an egg-shaped door of which the drummer would bang his head hard upon entering. The captain checked to see if the drummer was okay, letting him know they could heal him. Once inside, the trio walked down a hallway, and this led to a room with 3 silver-colored cots. They were instructed to take off their clothes. Thomas asked if they could keep their underwear on, and the captain obliged. At this point, the bass player took off his pants, but had on long johns. The trio would then laugh at the situation, and according to Thomas, the beings even seemed to understand the humor of the situation. The situation seemed to indicate that the band members felt quite comfortable at this point, yet whether they should have is debatable. At this point, the aliens brought in a cart with metal instruments and other devices on it. One of the beings would first grab some sort of light device and shine it on Thomas's skin. Thomas didn't see the light, but as he looked at his skin, he could see everything: veins, arteries, bones. Thomas then laid back on a table, and the beings would do the same scan of his whole body. Next, Thomas was asked to look at a light. It seemed to hypnotize him and wipe his memories. Once Thomas and the other band members woke up the next day, they would forget the events. However, this story is far from complete. For the next 10 years, memories of this event were blocked for Thomas, and presumably also for the other band members. Then sometime in the early 1980s, Thomas would read Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time, and memories of these events would come back. It's not evident what triggered it specifically, or if the events all came back at once, like what happens sometimes from people suffering from amnesia. That said, he couldn't recall everything. He still had missing time in events that he couldn't recall, and for that, he would reach out to Bud Hopkins, who would arrange a hypnotherapy session with therapist Dr. Aphrodite Clammer. Working with Dr. Clammer, Thomas would recall that night, after he was hypnotized by the strange object, he was taken to another room. Thomas was laying down, and around 5 aliens would wheel over a large machine with several different types of arms, with hoses and instruments. The beings would check over his whole body, taking hair and skin samples and putting them in tubes. After this, Thomas was told to dress, and the other 2 men joined him. Altogether, the beings would ask the men if they had any questions for them. One of the band members asked, "Are you from outer space?" To which the beings responded yes. One other question was, "Do you have bases on Earth?" The captain would respond, "Yes, we have many bases on Earth, some underwater, some in desolate areas where few people go. We have one here," pointing out to one of the portholes towards Lake Ontario. The next question Thomas would ask seemed to surprise the beings. What is the true religion on Earth? The beings were perplexed and answered, "Why would you ask a question like that?" Thomas responded by stating they were intellectually superior. The beings would state there is no correct religion on Earth, which seemed to surprise Thomas. 2 of the band members were then escorted out, with Thomas staying behind. The experience appeared to be a positive one, with the drummer smiling and waving back at the beings as he walked toward the van. Inside the ship, Thomas recalled he was going into a trance-like state and was overwhelmed with feelings of joy. Thomas was told that he had a special mission in helping their work and would be a beacon of light to people around him, helping people appreciate that aliens are real and that it was important work to do. He was then brought out of the trance-like state. Thomas then remembered the recorders in the bag, and he showed them to the beings. The being said, "What are these?" "Musical instruments. We play them for our entertainment." The being responded, "How do you play them?" Thomas said, "You blow air into them." Oddly, the alien didn't understand what it was being told. Thomas then put on a demonstration playing the recorder. The alien seemed to like it, and Thomas gave him one of the recorders as a souvenir. The being didn't understand what a souvenir was, though. As Thomas explained and gave it to him, he would notice the being had 3 fingers and nails that were long and curved down. The captain would then offer to walk Thomas back to the car, but Thomas declined. As he began walking back, he noticed his face was itchy, and soon he realized he had been crying. As Thomas came around the back of the van, he noticed that everyone was in a trance, sitting like zombies. The craft then suddenly shot off, and the group slowly began to come out of their hypnotized state. The strange man was now gone, and soon the group began to discuss what exactly they should do next. The drummer would say, "No, we can't report this. Everyone will think we are crazy. No one will believe us, and I don't want to be ridiculed over something like this." The guitarist, who didn't enter the craft, agreed on keeping it a secret too. It is thought the hybrid being stayed in the band and hypnotized the guitarist. Tom disagreed with the two and wanted to report the incident, but the group stated that if he did, they would deny the event. Still, perhaps what happened next was the most shocking aspect of this entire bizarre case. As the group was driving home, Thomas kept hearing a voice in his head saying, "You will forget this, you will forget this, you will forget this." Thomas fought it, and he fought it, and then finally, after some time, asked once again to the drummer and guitarist, "Should we report this?" The 2 men were completely baffled and said, "Report what?" The 2 men had already forgotten the incident. Thomas would return home, and that night, still fighting the command, attempted to write down the details of the night, but at some point he forgot and wound up going to bed. As stated, Thomas would recall many of the conscious memories after reading Lost Time, and the hidden ones through hypnosis. It's not known 100% how or what exactly triggered the memory recollection, but something in that book did. That said, what can we make of this fascinating close encounter of the 4th kind? The case has many interesting characteristics and elements that we see often in other cases. Perhaps the most interesting is the aspect of mind control. The beings seem to be able to clearly control the emotions and perceived experiences of the band members. In addition, they were able to block certain memories, while they seemed not too concerned with others. It's important to point out too that mind control and blocking memories is not really advanced. Even many humans are capable of hypnotizing others and getting them to behave in certain ways. Still, the interesting thing is that some people appear to be very easy to hypnotize, while others not so much. This is certainly relevant in this case, one in which the memories went away quicker for the band members than for Thomas. In addition to mind control and repressing memories, it is thought too the beings are capable of distorting perceptions, leaving many to believe their alien abduction experience was positive. This appeared to happen in this case, but looking at the facts, these men appear to have had their emotions manipulated. It's tough to imagine these band members would agree to be tested like they were. Many of the elements of the case are classic and things we see time and time again. The beings appeared to be grays, and the craft was silver-shaped and oval. The craft grabbed them on a desolate road. Perhaps the only strange detail that didn't add up in this case is that the beings were said to smell like aftershave. In many cases, grays are said to stink and smell quite horrible. It's been reported in a number of cases, and often their smell is the one thing most people remember. There are various theories on why they smell so bad. One of them states that these beings are biological, yet have no organs to dispose of waste. Many theorize they excrete their waste through their skin. That said, some believe greys are not biological and are actually robots, and it's something in their technology. Coming back to the case, it's widely believed the hitchhiker was connected to the beings. He was said to look human and didn't act surprised when the craft appeared. He also opened the door, although it seems that the greys could have probably done this themselves. One of the key questions is around the other band members too. They stated they would not admit the story, but did Bud Hopkins and Thomas try to track them down? Having even a second witness would have really added incredible validity to the case. Coming back to the questions to the beings, of the questions, it's tough to really conclude much. The beings said they were from outer space, but it's possible they live hidden on Earth or in a different dimension. Probably the most interesting question has to do with the bases on planet Earth. It's long been thought ETs have bases on Earth, and we've seen this on prior episodes. The religion question seems open to interpretation as well, although some might see it as evidence we were seeded by something else. Still, perhaps the most frustrating thing about this case is the beings told Thomas he had a special purpose, and that he would be instrumental in letting the world know about the beings. We see this in quite a number of cases, and it also draws a lot of criticism for several reasons. The first one being, why don't ETs ever take world leaders or people who have the ability to really change things? Another reason is, why take someone, tell him what they told Thomas, and then wipe his memory? That said, Thomas, after his sessions with the hypnotherapist, was able to uncover many more alien abductions that happened to him. Some of them are quite incredible, and one even involved his father, which isn't that surprising, as there are many cases where multiple family members are taken. On February 5th, 1971, two young men working as lumberjacks would have a bizarre encounter with an extraterrestrial. Peter Aliranta, then age 21, and Esko Juhani Snek, then age 18, were working out in the forest in Kinnula, Finland, wrapping up a hard day's work. This case features many similar and strange characteristics we've seen on other episodes on this channel. In today's episode, we will examine this strange close encounter of the third kind, a case that has become to be known as the 1971 Kinnula Finland Incident. Around 3 p.m. on February 5th, 1971, Peter Aliranta and Esko Snek were wrapping up their day of work when Peter would spot something strange off in the distance. There was a strange saucer-shaped metallic craft hovering up in the treetops. The craft was around 15 feet in diameter, and protruding from the bottom were 4 landing legs sticking out, each about 6 feet. As Peter watched, the craft descended down around 50 feet in front of him. Then, a round door opened in the bottom half of the craft. At this time, Esko Snek turned around, was still running his saw, and was unaware of what was happening. As Aliranta stared at the door, a small being would come through and hover down to the ground. The being was tiny, only around 2 feet tall, and wore a one-piece green-covered suit. It had a green helmet with some sort of black visor obscuring its face. It didn't have any hands and had green boots as well. It began to move toward Peter. Peter would later recall the being moved in a robotic fashion, very stiff. It also must have been very light, as it barely sunk in the snow when it walked. Peter wasn't scared of the being though. He started up his chainsaw and began walking toward the alien, ready to strike. At this point, Esko Snek heard the chainsaw and turned around. The being and Peter kept approaching each other like they were playing some sort of game of chicken. Then, around 20 feet apart, the alien turned around and began moving back to the craft. Peter, feeling confident, then began to chase the being back to the UFO. As Peter ran in the snow, he noticed several humanoids looking through the windows. Once the being got back to the craft, it began to hover up toward the hole it came out of. An aggressive Petter continued his charge though, and grabbed the boot of the being. However, once he grabbed it, the boot was scalding hot, and it burned his hand. Petter let go, moved back, and watched the being hover inside the UFO. The craft then began to make a buzzing sound and rose into the sky. Moments later, the object flew away and vanished. The whole event only lasted around 3 minutes. The two men felt weak after the event and had some difficulty breathing. Petter's burn marks were said to be visible for months after the event. Still, what can we make of this unusual encounter? It appears the case was investigated and was published in a 1971 article in the Flying Saucer Review. Still, it's not known how much of their story was challenged during the investigation. Probably the most questionable part of the story is that Petter chased the being as it was retreating. It seems this part of the story could have been either exaggerated or fabricated. It must be pointed out, though, that we followed many cases in which extraterrestrials expressed their discomfort with mankind's use of violence. Some abductees have even reported being told the beings haven't made themselves known because they believe that we are too violent. Could it be the case, despite the ETs being far more advanced, they are frightened of conflict? It is also certainly possible and probably likely the being was a robot and maybe was programmed to avoid conflict. Despite Petter's claims, the case does have similar characteristics that we've seen in other cases. For one, the fact the men reported a buzzing sound is a unique detail we see in quite a number of cases. Also, the size and shape of the craft are very typical of what many see. Which raises the question, what did the beings want then? Generally, there are two theories as far as what their intentions were. The first is that they came to communicate with the men. The second is they came to abduct them. While both are surely possible, it doesn't seem like, based on the information provided, one is more likely. There's quite a number of cases of beings, especially in the wilderness, attempting to communicate with humans, and in some of these cases, it doesn't appear they abducted anyone. It's not known what happened to the men after the event, and whether they had any more encounters or any more UFO sightings. On the morning of August 12th, 1983, one of the most famous alien encounters in the town of Aldershot, England would occur. This older case continues to be extremely controversial among ufologists and locals to the area. That said, this close encounter of the third kind is quite interesting and one that deserves examination. In this episode, we will explore the Alfred Burtoo alien encounter. Sometime after midnight on August 12, 1983, 77-year-old Alfred Burtoo grabbed his fishing gear and with his dog Tiny began heading down to the desolate Basingstoke Canal for some night fishing. After checking out a few spots, Alfred finally picked his fishing spot around 1 a.m. Then around 15 minutes later, Alfred would spot a bright light heading toward him. It settled down around 300 feet away, right next to the path next to the canal. After seeing the light, Alfred didn't think too much of it, as there was a military base just nearby. He poured himself a cup of tea and kept fishing, but soon things would get strange. First, Tiny began barking furiously in the direction of the light. Alfred, with eyes on the water, commanded his dog to stop, but Tiny wouldn't. Alfred then glanced over and saw two dark humanoid figures coming in his direction. He couldn't make out specifics on the beings at first, but Alfred wasn't too worried. This is because Alfred had a military background, and he initially believed the figures might just be coming to check on him. As Alfred smoked his cigarette, he began to make out more details on the figures. They kept approaching, and although he wasn't scared, he surely was becoming curious. The beings got closer and closer. Then, he would spot more details. They were around 4.5 feet tall, wearing green coveralls that covered their whole body. He would later recall there were no buttons or zippers, and it was as if the suit was molded to their bodies. Alfred couldn't see their faces, as the beings wore a green helmet with a black visor. The entities would get around 5 feet away and stop. Both stared at Alfred for several moments while Tiny continued barking. Then they gestured to him to come along. Alfred would begin following them toward the light. One being walked in front, while another one walked behind him. At this time, Alfred was more curious than scared. He would later recall that some of this had to do with his military training, and some of it had to do with his age and failing health. As he approached the ship, which rested in the air, Alfred would climb the stairs along with the beings. As he entered the room, he had to duck down slightly as to not hit his head. The room was all black and had 8 sides and was warmer than the outside. It had a foul smell, which Alfred compared to rotting meat. As he looked around, he would spot no bolts or screws in the walls, and it appeared to be smooth all over. During this time, Alfred could see the beings out of the corner of his eye. Then he heard some sort of noise, and the beings disappeared behind the wall. It's not clear if they just went through it, or a silent door just slid open, but now Alfred was standing in the room, all by himself. After a few minutes, in the middle of the room, a large shaft rose up from the bottom. Right next to it were 2 more beings, almost identical in appearance to the first 2. The shaft was large, around 4 feet in circumference. Then Alfred would be instructed to come over and stand under the light. He couldn't see any light, though, in the room. He stepped over to the right, and an amber light was right on him. It was glowing from ceiling to floor. He stepped into the light with no hesitation. While the light was shining on him, one of the beings would ask his age. Alfred responded that he would be 78 at his next birthday. He was instructed to turn around, and once he did, the being said, "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purposes." Somewhat surprised, he left the craft and went back to his fishing spot. There he would grab a sip of tea and notice about an hour had passed. Alfred alleged to be unfazed by the experience and got back to fishing. As he was doing this, he would hear a noise from the craft and also see a bright white light. The craft then shot off into the night sky. Shockingly, Alfred would continue to fish all night, and then around 10 a.m. several policemen would walk by. He would mention the craft in his experience, and astonishingly, one of the policemen didn't seem surprised and even mentioned it was probably here to check out the military base. As the weeks progressed, Alfred found himself thinking more and more about that night in his experience. He wasn't sure of many things, but he did want answers. In October of that year, he decided to reach out to the local newspaper, the Aldershot News, and hope that someone else had seen the craft that night, or perhaps had had a similar experience. Alfred wouldn't find any other witnesses, but the event would draw the attention of several ufologists, such as Timothy Good, who would investigate the case. Good believed Alfred and thought he was telling the truth, although he wished that he would have tried to ask more questions to the beings. What can we make of this incredible story by Alfred Burtoo? Like many cases, there appears to be some things that make it seem genuine, while other aspects that make it seem fabricated. Many skeptics have questioned the story at hand. Some asked how Burtoo was able to remain so calm through the event. Also, what about his dog? It seemed to stay behind at the fishing spot, but some think the dog would have insisted on coming along. In addition to this, it's never good from a credibility perspective to wait months to report a story like this. This is somewhat of an unfair criticism, as it's understandable how people just want to move on with their lives. Still, Alfred was 77 and didn't seem to be scared of much. Several things in the story also align with other UFO reports. For one, the beings were near a military base. It's well documented, even in present day, that UFOs seem to get spotted near military installations. There's various theories on this, which include scary ones, like they are gathering intelligence data and assessing our defenses, and other ones suggesting they are just curious about our capabilities. One interesting case that has incredible similarities is the 1971 Finland forestry alien encounter, which we covered on this channel not too long ago. In that case, the being is described almost exactly the same way. The being in that case had green coveralls with a green helmet and a black visor. The only difference between these two cases, in terms of the beings, is that in the Finland case, the beings were described as 2 feet tall, while Alfred said they were around 4 feet. The Finland case happened 7 years before Alfred's encounter. Alfred alleged in the encounter the beings didn't want him because of his declining health. This is something we've seen in other cases as well, and not too surprising. Alfred had mixed emotions on this decision by the beings though, as a part of him wanted to travel through the universe and get to do things few have done. With his declining health, Alfred would die several years after the encounter. There's rumors that a strong military presence now controls the area where the event occurred. It's reported to be tough to get into and out of, and some speculate the military has recovered crafts or possibly been in contact with the beings. Of course, none of this is known for sure. While we might never get the answers we want in the Alfred Burtoo incident, it surely is an interesting case to examine. On October 17, 1973, Jeff Greenhaw, the police chief of Falkville, Alabama, received a strange call from a resident. The frantic person reported a UFO craft had descended on a nearby field. Off duty at the time, Chief Greenhaw grabbed his revolver along with a Polaroid camera and headed over to see what was happening. When he arrived, there was no UFO. However, something else was there. Something that changed Captain Greenhaw's life forever. In this episode, we will examine this classic 1973 alien encounter, a case that became to be known as the Alabama Metal Man. Around 10 p.m. on October 17, 1973, Police Chief Jeff Greenhaw was relaxing at home, hoping to have a relaxing evening. Then the phone rang, and his life would change forever. Reports vary as to whether this caller was anonymous or Greenhaw knew the individual, but on the other end of the phone, someone was frantically telling him a UFO had landed in a nearby field. Chief Greenhaw grabbed his gun, keys, and Polaroid and sped toward the field. On the way there, he radioed the event to the station, but when he arrived, there was no UFO at the scene. He turned off his car and began canvassing the area. While no UFO was spotted, Chief Greenhaw did see something else, something that was truly bizarre. As he was walking around, he saw something just on the side of the road and shouted at it. He approached it to get a better look and could see that this was something like he had never seen before. The being was around 6 feet tall and appeared to be covered from head to foot in tinfoil. It began approaching the police vehicle. All its movements were extremely jerky and mechanical. The chief would snap 4 Polaroid pictures of the being. As it got closer, Chief Greenhaw turned on the headlights to the car. This seemed to scare it, and the entity took off running. The being was fast, extremely fast. Chief Greenhaw hopped in his vehicle and chased it through the field, but since the field was uneven terrain, he could only get up to 35 miles per hour. Notably though, the being was getting farther and farther away from him. The chief's car eventually fell into a ditch, and the being got away. Greenhaw would later recall the being was running faster than any human he had ever seen run. Like many alien encounters and UFO sightings, the event would take a life of its own after it happened. Greenhaw would tell his story, and it would wreck his life. The town mocked him and lost all respect for the young captain. Several weeks after reporting the incident, the town council would fire Captain Greenhaw. Soon, his wife would leave him, and to add insult to injury, Greenhaw's house burned down sometime after the report. Greenhaw would go into a deep depression and isolate from others. He recalled that he couldn't trust anyone, and many of his friends stabbed him in the back. While Greenhaw's case is surely a fascinating and a strange one, it is quite controversial. Author Charlton Hall would write a book claiming when he was a teenager, him and his friends faked several alien encounters in the Alabama area. Among these, Hall alleges he and his friends were responsible for the 1973 Alabama Metal Man. While Hall alleges to have faked the incidents, there are still questions surrounding the event. The most notable question surrounds the speed at which the being moved away. If it's true that the being ran at the speeds even close to what Chief Greenhaw alleges, then there's no way that these teenagers could have faked this. Still, much of the event could have been faked. The phone call could have been a prank. A teenager could have wrapped himself in tinfoil and created the alien costume. The mechanical movements as well could have been fabricated. Probably the key piece of evidence in this case are the photos. The photos were examined and have never been proved to be a hoax. Around 10 years after the event, the originals and negatives were stolen, but luckily copies were still around. Like many UFO sightings and alien encounters, the details in this photo are tough to make out, and it's really inconclusive. As a result, this case really comes down to eyewitness testimony. One of the big hurdles for Jeff Greenhaw has to do with the fact that he was the sole witness. While many believe Greenhaw in its story, it's tough to substantiate stories like this with just one eyewitness. To make matters worse, this case occurred in the early 1970s, a time when reporting a UFO or an alien encounter was definitely met with ridicule. This has led many to speculate there are many other undocumented cases out there. It's important to note too, there have been other cases of robotic-like aliens, so these are not really that rare. One case we covered on this channel earlier was one involving the Cisco Grove encounter. The case of the Alabama Metal Man has inspired much, appearing in television and books and being a popular Southern alien encounter. One final point concerning this case is that Jeff Greenhaw never wavered around what he saw. He regretted reporting it since it caused him so much pain, but he has remained adamant about the events of that night. On January 7th, 1970, Swedish cross-country skiers Arno Heinonen and Esko Viho were out training in the woods of Imjärvi, Finland for an upcoming competition. Arno was 36 years old at the time and working as a woodman, while Esko was aged 38 and worked as a farmer. Both men lived simple lives. However, that day, they would have one of the strangest alien encounters in the history of Finland. The incident produced adverse health effects in both men and was considered to be quite credible early on. However, one of the men, Arno, alleged to have continued contact with the beings, which led many to cast doubt on the original story. In this episode, we will explore this unbelievable 1970 alien encounter that happened in the city of Imjärvi, Finland. Around 4:45 in the afternoon, as the sun was setting, after cross-country skiing for most of the day, the two Finnish skiers decided to stop in a clearing and rest. The day was extremely cold, with complete visibility in the sky, and the two men were looking forward to wrapping up their training session and heading home. After about 5 minutes of standing in the clearing, the men began to hear a faint buzzing sound. They looked up to the north and saw a light which was moving toward them, and soon it began descending. As the light came closer and closer to the ground, soon the men saw that the light was surrounded by a reddish-grayish cloud. As the craft came down to about 50 feet, they noticed that inside the cloud, sat some sort of craft or object. It was around 10 feet long and had a dome on top, appearing to be composed of some type of metal. The craft then began to hover over them while continuing to descend, and the men could now see the underside. There was a short tube protruding out from the center. Interestingly, the tube was very small, being only about 10 inches round. As the craft kept coming lower, the gray-reddish mist dissipated and the buzzing sound turned down to a faint noise. At this point, the craft was only around 10 to 12 feet above the men. Then, an extremely bright light shot down from the craft. The light lit up the snow and seemed to blacken the edges of it somehow. The light spread out as it descended and appeared to be around 2 feet in diameter on the surface. The two men were stunned, speechless, and not saying a word to one another during this time. Still, it's important to note they didn't appear to be scared. Then inside the light, a creature would suddenly appear. Neither man saw the being descend from the light, but rather just suddenly become visible. The being was quite small and thin, being shorter than 3 feet. It had on green overalls and also darker green boots. The being appeared to have a hooked nose and also was wearing some type of coned helmet. Neither man seemed to be able to recall the eyes, which is somewhat odd. This could be due to the bright light obscuring it somehow though. The creature was carrying some type of black box. There was some sort of bright yellow light coming out of it that was flashing. Initially, the light was shining between the two men and not hitting them directly. Then the being turned slightly, and the bright light hit Arno. At that time, a gray mist floated down into the forest, and something that appeared as sparks began flying from the area in the snow where the light was. The sparks, which were multicolored, hit the men, and soon the gray-red smoke was so thick that the men couldn't see the being or even each other. Then suddenly the men saw the white light from the craft shoot up, and both the light and the being disappeared. At the same time, the smoke vanished along with the craft. The men were surprised by the events, but unlike most, they reported they weren't that scared. They were even telling some jokes during the event. However, they would soon come to realize this wasn't a laughing matter. Immediately after the craft vanished, both men experienced damaging physical effects. Arno tried to walk, but his leg was so numb that he fell in the snow. He recalled his right leg just gave out, since that probably had the most contact with the light. Arno was forced to sit down. Esko initially thought this was a joke, but soon came to realize that Arno was serious. Esko was forced to drag his friend down the rest of the mountain. They went around 3 kilometers and arrived at Arno's mom's house. She would later recall the men looked like they were in bad shape, but not really scared. Esko's face was red and swollen. Arno was in much worse shape though. His back was hurting as well as his joints. He soon was vomiting and his urine turned black. Things would only get worse for Arno though. He was treated by a doctor, but even after 10 days the symptoms remained. He couldn't work, was extremely lethargic, had trouble balancing, and began having problems with his memory too. Dr. Polly Kajanajo, who examined Arno, couldn't explain the black urine. He thought it could be blood in the urine, but he stated that that wouldn't last for months like Arno experienced. Esko would have adverse health effects too. He had issues with his eyes and headaches for days after the event and saw Dr. Kajanajo. Dr. Kajanajo thought the men could have been exposed to something radioactive. While the men made some incredible claims, there were reports of others seeing strange lights in the area that night as well. Elna Stellari, who worked on a farm around 10 kilometers away, reported seeing a strange light. Also, a boy in Paso reported seeing an odd light too. In June of 1970, the two men would revisit the site with the journalist. Oddly, when the men and the journalist arrived, the hands of all three began to turn red and swelled up. Arno would report getting a crippling headache as well. While the initial sighting was deemed pretty credible by ufologists, subsequent claims by Arno would come to damage the credibility of the case. After the initial sighting, Arno would claim to have been visited by the beings at least 23 more times. Arno has a number of incredible stories from his encounters, many of which seem outlandish. For example, on one encounter, Arno alleged he heard a female voice telepathically guide him to a secluded spot in the woods. There, he would meet a gorgeous woman, or what looked like a woman. She was around 5 feet tall, had blonde hair cropped to her shoulders, and blue eyes. The being hovered or floated over to Arno, communicating with him in Finnish. She told him she was 180 years old, although she looked 20. She went on to tell him that he had met several different types of aliens from her planet. Arno would claim to speak with the woman one more time. On his second meeting, Arno attempted to photograph her, and according to Arno, she disappeared right as the photo snapped. He also alleged he tried to take a photo of the craft, but as he was raising his camera, it flew out of his hands. Arno's accounts of his interactions and subsequent events have led many ufologists to doubt his story. Without question, the later events have hurt his credibility. For example, Arno alleges to have received a green pen from the beings, but then says he misplaced it. Also, the reports around the cameras have led many to cast doubt on his story. This has led some to believe the initial story was true, but the effects experienced by the initial encounter have damaged him psychologically. Some speculate this has led to delusions and hallucinations. Still, while many of Arno's later claims sound like fiction, the initial encounter does appear to have some credible elements. 1. Both men experienced severe adverse health effects for quite some time. These were cross-country skiers in peak condition, and the event left them in a very fragile state. It seems unlikely they would be able to fabricate this. In addition, there were 2 witnesses, and both their stories were extremely similar. It's important to point out, too, that it's possible Arno was telling the truth about the later events. Many of the stories have elements similar to other alien encounters, such as telepathic communication and beings that appear attractive. Could it be the case Arno liked the attention from the initial encounter and fabricated the later stories? It's surely a possibility. Unfortunately for Arno and Esco, though, evidence for these close encounters of the third kind in the UFO community is based almost primarily on witness credibility, and after Arno told his later stories, he lost almost all the credibility he first had. In 1973, a New Hampshire woman would start banging on the door of a rural home in the middle of the night. When residents Mr. and Mrs. Bowden finally answered the door, they would be stunned to see a hysterical, sobbing woman begging to be let in. After some time, the young woman would tell the couple a UFO had just stalked her and tried to take her. In this episode, we will dive into this frightening case, one that will make you think about driving down remote roads in the middle of the night. This story has come to be known as the 1973 Goffstown Incident. On Friday, November 2nd, 1983, around 2:45 a.m., Lindia Morell clocked out of work at the Swedish sauna in Manchester, New Hampshire. Lindia talked with a coworker and decided to drive and meet for coffee at Roy's restaurant on South Willow Street. The two talked for around 45 minutes and then departed, each going their separate ways. Lindia stopped to get gas and then proceeded on Route 114A toward her home. As she drove out of the city, her attention would soon turn toward a bright yellow light up to the left. Lindia didn't think too much of it, and being very tired, did her best to ignore it. As she kept looking at it though, she knew it must be something. Very soon it started flashing red, green, and blue colors. While she initially thought it could be a planet, right next to it she could see the planet Mars, and the UFO was significantly brighter. Lindia would travel about a mile, and noticed the light hadn't changed positions but was much brighter. Then all of a sudden the bright light would go out. At this point, Lindia believed there was a strong possibility that this was a UFO, as she knew it couldn't be a planet. After about a minute, the light came back on once again, in the same position. The UFO would continue to do this for the next 10 to 15 minutes, appearing and disappearing. During this time, Lindia saw several cars pass her by, and some speculate that the craft might have been disappearing in order to avoid detection by other vehicles. Some think it could have been a mechanical problem. At this point, Lindia was on the outskirts of Goffstown. As she continued on Route 114, she would crest a hill and be stunned to see the craft right up ahead. It was much lower now, and the light much brighter. According to Lindia, the craft appeared to be an orange and gold globe, completely covered with a honeycomb design of hexagons, except for a window that was oval-shaped. The window's color was paler and located on the upper left portion of the object. The craft was relatively small compared to other UFOs, being only around the size of a large car. Lindia then noticed flashes of red, green, and blue coming from a source in the center, and they were switching back and forth. Even more bizarre, a steady, high-pitched whine was emitted by the object, and not only could she hear the sound, but she felt it throughout her body as a tingling sensation. Initially, Lindia was amazed at what she was seeing, but her feelings would quickly turn to panic. Strangely, she began gripping the steering wheel extremely tight and couldn't let go for some reason. She would report her eyes were being pulled toward the craft, as if something was trying to take control of her. Unlike many other cases, there were no issues with the car's engine or electrical systems. At this point, the car was moving quickly toward the craft, and Lindia would speculate it was being pulled by the UFO. She would later state it was like her car was being pulled like a magnet. Even more frightening during this time, for around half a mile, Lindia couldn't really recall what happened during the stretch. She stated that her eyes remained on the UFO, but she has no memory of actually driving. Lindia did point out it could just be the case she was in shock and did it subconsciously. As she got even closer to the craft, at this point she was only a few hundred feet away. Here, she would notice a figure in the upper left-hand window. She could see the being's head, upper body, and arms were visible above a dark horizontal surface which covered the lower portion of the oval window. The legs were not visible. Behind the humanoid was some sort of white background. The being's body was gray, and it seemed like it was a darker shade of gray than the face. The entity had a round head and large egg-shaped eyes that wrapped around it. In general, it fit the description of a gray alien, except it had a peculiar detail. Lindia would report it had wrinkles or loose skin, a feature reported from time to time, but usually not with gray encounters. She couldn't say for sure whether the being wore a uniform, but speculated that it did. It had a slit for a mouth and no ears or nose. It's possible, though, that she missed it. Still, what caught her attention the most were the eyes. They seemed to mesmerize her, and she fell into some sort of trance-like state, unable to look away from them. In looking in them, she said the being might have spoke to her telepathically and assured her it would be okay. For a few moments, she reported a sense of calm, and while she couldn't be certain it communicated, she sensed she would be okay. Then suddenly, Lindia woke up from her trance. She realized everything that was happening and immediately began to panic, realizing the UFO might just take her. She took control of the car and began speeding down the road faster, past the cemetery and ending up at the Bune house. She knew the household because Lindia was only 3/4 of a mile from her home. She jumped out of the car, leaving it running, and started running toward the door. The UFO changed positions and kept following her, with its buzzing sound growing louder. As she started running up to the door, the family German Shepherd ran at Lindia, growling. Lindia, who was normally scared of dogs, smacked the German Shepherd across the face and hysterically ran to the front door. She started banging and after around 2 minutes the couple came down. Lindia grabbed onto Mr. Bowden and stated, "Help me, I'm not drunk, I'm not on drugs. A UFO just tried to pick me up." What happened next was very strange. According to Miss Bowden, she said the witness was covering her ears complaining about a sound. However, neither she nor her husband remembered hearing anything. Lindia would later recall that after a few minutes in the home, the sound would go away. She also stated during this time there would be a tingling sensation that would dissipate as well. The couple at this time would call the police. It was now 4:30 a.m. and soon Goffstown patrolman Daniel Jubenville, age 23, arrived. Once he got there, the four headed outside and would spot a strange light in the sky. When he shined his flashlight in the direction of the light, it would turn off. Oddly, the young officer would state that the light probably was Mars, even though it appeared to be turning on and off. They headed back in and Officer Jubenville took down notes on Lindia's story, and although it was tough to believe, Daniel would note that Lindia was not under the influence. All this said, what can we make of her story? In general, there are two theories surrounding her case. The first is that she confused either a planet or something else, became frightened, and then perhaps being embarrassed, made up that she had seen a UFO. Skeptics point out she was looking in the same direction as the planet, and also being late at night, isolated, she might have become frightened on the dark, desolate roads. Still, this doesn't really explain why the light turned off and on and was witnessed by 4 separate individuals. Surely planets and stars don't do this, and being back in the 70s, it wasn't a satellite either. This leads to the second theory, which is that she spotted a UFO. It seems like this craft was targeting her, perhaps because she was in a remote area. It's not evident that she was taken, although it could have occurred. Still, we see things in her case we see all too often. The first is the beings, even being far away, seem to be able to put her in a trance-like state. This is reported time and time again in cases, and Lindia seemed to be under their spell. Interestingly, she was able to break from it, and perhaps the beings were unable to fully hypnotize her. The second thing we saw in this case that happens often is the witness had their encounter in a dark, remote area. Many close encounters happen when no one is around, and often on isolated roads. It seems obvious the beings want to stay in the shadows, but why and for what reason is anyone's guess. Lindia, like many, was followed in the middle of the night and approached when no other vehicles were around. One interesting aspect of this case has to do with the craft and the being. The craft was certainly unusual, appearing in a honeycomb form and also being pretty small. In addition to this, the being spotted seemed to look like a stereotypical gray alien. Lindia stated, though, that it had wrinkles, which doesn't fit the normal description. That's not incredibly unusual, but something a little odd. It should be pointed out grays are widely believed to be the worker bees in the alien hierarchy. They are thought to be the biological robots given commands to perform specific tasks. Some don't believe this, but many cases seem to point in this direction. Should we believe Lindia's story? In general, it seems pretty credible, although the evidence is not overwhelming. She was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol, nor did she seek to gain fame. In addition, others witnessed the light, albeit they didn't seem as concerned. This could clearly be chalked up to the distance, though it was, and also the fact it was so late at night. The Bones probably wanted to head back to sleep, and the officer probably wanted to get back to the station. After this event, it doesn't appear that Lindia had any other alien encounters or saw any other UFOs in her life. During the 1950s, UFO sightings and alien encounters were prevalent around the world. While the United States appeared to be the epicenter of activity, Europe had a large number of unexplained UFO sightings. In particular, Italy experienced a number of incredible sightings, some of which we have covered on prior episodes on this channel, like the Sanina case, or the 1954 football game in which thousands spotted a UFO over the stadium. In this episode, we will cover a UFO sighting, an alien encounter that occurred just prior to the 1954 football game. It is said to be one of the better known alien encounters in Italy. In time, this case became to be known as the 1950 Varese Incident. On the evening of April 24, 1950, Bruno Ficini, a mechanic, was working the late shift in his local factory during a violent thunderstorm. Bruno was 40 years old at the time and married with a young son. He lived right next to the factory, which was located in Varese, about 50 miles from the city of Milan. Around 10 p.m., once the rain and lightning stopped, Bruno stepped outside to have a cigarette. As he relaxed, he would soon see a strange light flashing in a field across the way. Bruno was somewhat concerned as the lights were where a high voltage power line was. He believed the line, which supplied power to much of the town, may have been knocked down. He was concerned that a downed power line could be extremely dangerous, since children like his often played in the area. After not seeing the light for a few moments, he decided to head back. Just as he was turning around, he noticed the flashing lights once again. Bruno decided to walk to get closer and see what it was. As he got up closer, Bruno would see something next to the power line. It was some sort of craft, around 30 feet wide and 10 feet across. There was a small ladder in the middle, lit by a greenish light. Bruno could make out what he believed was a human. It appeared to be making repairs or welding something together. There were also two other figures. They all were wearing gray tight-fitted suits and helmets obscuring their appearance. At this point, Bruno believed they were humans and yelled out if they needed help. He believed it could have been some type of experimental craft, possibly American. They muttered something back, though he couldn't understand. Bruno would later state they spoke in a guttural language, which he couldn't make out. Despite this, Bruno indicated he thought they tried to wave him inside the craft. Not only was their language weird, but they also moved awkwardly. At this point, he was able to see more strange aspects of the UFO. He then realized these figures weren't human. He suddenly became terrified, panicked, and started running away. At this point, one of the beings shot Bruno with a ray of light. The beam of light knocked him to the ground, and Bruno hit his head on a rock. As he laid there bleeding, he could see the ladder go up into the craft and the light coming through a door. The buzzing around intensified, and the craft took off into the sky. The following day, Bruno reported his encounter to the police. At the scene, there were things indicating something did happen the night before. Police found burn patches on the ground and indentation marks of something very heavy. Also, police discovered some weird green pieces of a metal-like substance. Bruno believed this was from the welding, and that the green pieces of debris were leftovers of the process. The fragments were analyzed, and the results concluded that the fragments were an anti-friction material containing several types of metal along with a lubricant. One test revealed some sort of unknown metal. It was a yellow-white color, but was not any type of element found on Earth. A photo was taken after the event of Bruno with his clothes from that night. In the photo, the clothes appear to be blackened somewhat. Bruno received quite a bit of media attention after the incident and was interviewed multiple times after the event. It is said that Bruno's story has remained consistent over the years. Still, with many reports on the matter, it appears some details may have been lost in translation. For example, the outfit the beings are wearing is said in some reports as being more like a spacesuit than a dive suit. Also, some reports say that Bruno was at home, while others say he was nearby. His home was right next to the factory, and this could have been something misinterpreted somehow. Still, what can we make of this case? Bruno's case certainly seems realistic and has many elements we have seen in other UFO sightings and alien encounters. The one interesting detail to call out is the buzzing sound. This is a unique detail and something we've seen in other cases. On this channel, we covered at least 2 episodes where we saw this. This includes the Imjärvi Finland alien encounter and also the Utsuro incident. In addition to being a pretty credible witness, there was evidence at the scene. Police would find massive marks on the ground, and the results of the material discovered were inconclusive. In sum, this case appears to have some very credible aspects. In 1976, country singer Johnny Sands was in Las Vegas, Nevada, promoting his latest record. Sands was a pretty accomplished country singer, appearing on the Today Show, and also singing in shows with country music legends like Charlie Daniels and Merle Haggard. In addition to this, Sands also worked as a stuntman, magician, and escape artist. However, there would be no escape from what came for him. In January 1976, his case is considered quite credible, as hundreds would see UFOs in the sky that night, and Sands would pass a polygraph as well. In this episode, we will examine this close encounter of the third kind, the case of Johnny Sands. On January 29th, 1976, Johnny Sands hopped in his car leaving Las Vegas so he could drive and promote his record and also explore some older western towns. After a long day, Sands left the town of Pahrump, located about an hour outside of Las Vegas, and began heading home around 10 p.m. Sands hopped on the Blue Diamond Road, and around 10:30 p.m. he would spot a strange craft in the sky. He was pretty preoccupied at the moment though, thinking about his music, and initially ignored the craft. The craft would then follow him for around 3 miles, when suddenly his engine started sputtering, and he pulled over on the shoulder. He started checking the car, making sure he wasn't out of gas, or there wasn't a problem with the engine, and at that moment, forgot completely about the UFO. Then, Johnny Sands would see something he would never forget. Around 1,000 feet in the air, Sands spotted the craft. It was around 60 feet long, oval-shaped, and had a burnt orange color. As well, it had a large ring around it. In the ring, there were portholes around 10 feet in diameter and around 5 feet apart. Between each porthole, there was a light and lights on the end, flashing white. The craft moved over a nearby mountain, lighting up the entire area. At this point, Sands was pretty scared and decided to get back to work, fixing his car. He tried removing several things and inspecting them, but had no luck. Then he turned back around, and he spotted several humanoids in his headlights down the road. In a frightening turn of events, Sands froze and couldn't move. It appears the beings had paralyzed him. The beings then approached, with one coming around 3 feet away, while the other stopped at about 5 feet. The beings were around 5'8", 140 pounds, and looked incredibly strange. Sands would state that these pale creatures had something on the sides of their face that resembled gills. Even more odd, the gills seemed to move incredibly quickly on their face. They were bald, with no eyebrows, and had small black eyes with white pupils, and also had a flat nose, which Sands would compare to a pug's nose. The skin was extremely wrinkled, something we see in other cases like this. The beings wore silver coveralls that had a white strap that ran from their shoulder to their waist. They also had another belt around their waist with different types of gadgets on them. What happened next would truly be shocking. A conversation would ensue with Sands asking some questions and the beings asking some as well. They communicated through telepathy. It's important to note at the time the APR report was written, the beings would threaten Sands, saying if he revealed the whole conversation of which occurred, they would come for him. In a later interview with Brent Rains, around 30 years later, Sands would reveal the details he was asked not to discuss. According to Sands, for around a 10-minute period, the beings and Sands would communicate with Sands asking the first question, "Where did you come from?" The beings pointed up to the sky and didn't say a word. The being would then ask Sands what he was doing there. Sands responded he was in Las Vegas and doing a record and that he was a country music singer. The creature then asked, why were so many people in Las Vegas? Sands stated it was a tourist town and that people came to Las Vegas from all over. Sands was then asked, what is your means of communication? He didn't understand the question really. The being seemed to become angry and stated, answer the question. Once again though, a frightened Sands repeated that he didn't understand the question. The humanoid turned to the other at this point, and the beings seemed to be communicating something to one another, although it's not clear what. This lasted 2 to 3 minutes. It should be pointed out once again the beings' mouths didn't move, and they communicated with Sands through telepathy. The beings then turned around and warned Sands once again about seeing them, stating, don't say anything about this meeting. We know where you are, and we'll see you again. In the interview with Brent Rains in 2009, Sands would state the being pulled out a small ball that grew into the size of a basketball and had sparks flying all around it. Next, the being said, you see, nuclear explosions are causing a problem in the solar system. These things that you're setting off on this Earth are causing troubles not only for you, but for us, and we cannot have this kind of thing to continue because it's going to upset the balance of everything that we intend for the future. Sands was confused as he was an entertainer and didn't know almost anything about the topic. He next asked if the beings were evil, to which it responded, harm comes from evil. Sands would ask their age, to which the creature responded, we are before the beginning of what you know as time. The being would go on to say they would see him again in time, and he would understand the reason. It doesn't appear that the beings kept their promise, as the 2009 interview with Brent Rains didn't reveal further contact. After the 10-minute conversation, they walked off into the night, and a white flash lit up the sky. The beings then disappeared. After this, Sands went to the Air Force Base in the area and was referred to the APRO. There he would converse with John Romero, who would ask him to take a polygraph. At the time, Sands was in a bit of a predicament. Hundreds, possibly thousands, saw strange lights that night, and word was circling around town around his experience. Sands didn't want people to think his story was all a publicity stunt, and had to manage telling his story along with also promoting his record. Eventually, the APRO would arrange for him to take a polygraph with Dr. R.L. Nolan and pass. Dr. Nolan was an FBI agent with over 27 years of experience administering the test. One interesting thing did happen in the test though. The test showed that Sands was holding back something. It's important to point out he was not lying. For decades, Johnny would not talk about some of the things the beings asked him not to discuss. Decades later, according to Johnny Sands, the beings would tell him that night that the governments and militaries around the world were aware of their existence. It's important to note the beings didn't say what the relationship was between the two. What can we make of this incredible close encounter of the third kind? There's quite a bit to unpack from this case. Probably the first thing to note here is that the being's appearance was definitely strange and not the typical gray or Nordic alien. That said, there are other cases with people reporting very wrinkly beings, and of course many cases of entities warning about the dangers of nuclear weapons. There's quite a bit of supporting evidence, even though Sands was all alone. Many saw a UFO or lights in the Las Vegas area in the sky that night. Also, Sands passed a lie detector, and his story was considered credible by the APRO. In addition to this, Sands had a lot to lose, as he was doing well, and this could sink his career. Some debate this though, as he was an entertainer and didn't have a career like a politician, which relied on reputation. One other similarity as well with the other cases we see is his car dying without reason. We see this time and time again. Still though, in examining the APR report versus the 2009 Rains interview, there does appear to be minor discrepancies. First, in the Rains interview, Johnny stated that the beings spoke through telepathy. However, in the APRO report, it seems to imply the beings' words came through them, like as if it was coming out of their bodies. It's important to note that the APRO report stated the entities did not move their mouths, and we might be misinterpreting the communication method in the report. One other thing to point out, there was no mention or worries around nuclear programs in the original APRO report. It's pretty well known in 2009 that ETs are concerned over nuclear weapons based on numerous reports. In all fairness, he may have been told to not discuss this though. Sands also stated he underwent hypnosis in the 2009 interview, but the APRO bulletin stated he did not and was afraid of hypnosis. Once again though, he might have done hypnosis later on. Later, Johnny appeared to have some run-ins with the Men in Black. He stated on one occasion a man told him the gills from the beings were because the beings were semi-aquatic. The strange man would tell him that these beings were from around the star Sirius. Why was Johnny selected to meet the beings? There was never a reason given to him. However, we speculate that Johnny's heritage may have been a factor. Johnny Sands is a Native American, and perhaps with a culture very spiritual in nature, one of his ancestors had contact with the beings. Johnny Sands was no ordinary man. He worked as a stuntman, escape artist, singer, and much more. In 1983, he broke the world record for the fastest straitjacket escape artist in the world with a record speed of 79 hundredths of a second. In 2004, he stayed in a stainless steel glass topped casket that was submerged under 600 gallons of water and appeared at fairs throughout the eastern United States. He was inducted into the Houdini Hall of Fame in Niagara Falls. As a stuntman, he performed over 15,000 movie stunts, being in movies with legends like Elvis. Despite this, his night in Vegas in January 1976 would be the most significant event of his life. He still goes and stares at the sky, looking for the beings, and talks out loud, asking them to return and talk with him. Maybe one day he will speak with them once again. On April 18th, 1961, around 11 a.m., Wisconsin resident Joe Simonton was sitting down and eating a late breakfast when he would have one of the weirdest alien encounters in history. At the time, Simonton resided in the town of Eagle River and was working as a chicken farmer. As Joe was eating, he would suddenly hear a strange sound outside. It sounded like a jet being throttled back, and Joe would later describe it as sounding like knobby tires on wet pavement. Joe quickly headed outside and was stunned to see a UFO drop out of the sky. The craft was silver, 12 feet tall, and around 30 feet in diameter. Joe noted it was incredibly bright. He would later state it was brighter than chrome. On one edge of the craft, there were what appeared to be exhaust pipes around 6 inches in diameter. The craft continued descending and would land. Then nothing could prepare Joe for what happened next. A hatch would open on the side. He would spot 3 beings. He described them as having dark skin and looking Italian. They were around 5 feet in height and weighed around 125 pounds each. He aged the being as somewhere between 25 to 30 years old. The beings wore dark blue uniforms and had turtleneck collars. They also wore helmets and were clean shaven. The visitors would next communicate with Joe through telepathy. They had a silver-shaped jug that was around 12 inches tall and had 2 handles. Joe stated the jug seemed to be made of the same material as the craft. The beings would communicate to Joe that they needed or wanted water. They handed the jug to him, and Joe would state the jug was absolutely beautiful. The strange metal-like material weighed less than steel, but more than aluminum. Joe left the beings and headed down to the water pump he had in his basement. After filling up the jug, he went back up, still in awe of it. As he got to the craft, Joe had to lean against it to hand it back, and he would get a better look as to what was happening inside the craft. In it, it was black, and there appeared to be 3 multicolored instrument panels for driving the ship. Most oddly, though, he noticed that one of the beings appeared to be grilling something that resembled pancakes. One of the beings would notice Joe seeing the pancakes and grab 3 for him. The pancakes were small, about 3 inches in diameter, and perforated with small holes. After the being, who Joe thought was the leader, handed him the pancakes, he touched his forehead, and what Joe would later interpret was the being's way of showing gratitude. The leader then closed the craft. It would rise up about 20 feet and then instantaneously shot off to the south. It was such a powerful blast of air that it bent the tops of the pine trees in the nearby area. Next, Joe would try one of the pancakes. He would later state it tasted like cardboard. The other 2 pancakes he gave to Judge Frank Carter. Carter would send the pancakes off to be tested. He sent them to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP. NICAP, though, refused to test them. This upset Carter, who wanted to give a lecture on the experience. Carter was said to be an avid UFO enthusiast. Despite NICAP not wanting to get involved, the case drew the attention of J. Allen Hynek. During this time, Hynek was an astronomer at Northwestern University. After studying many cases and investigating them, he became convinced that UFOs are real. This would lead him to find his own group to study them. The group would even take over NICAP's files after they went under. Hynek would investigate many cases, such as the Red Bluff UFO incident and also the Lonnie Zamora case, both of which we covered on this channel. Most notably, though, he created the Hynek classification system, which is still in effect today. This is the Close Encounters scale. Hynek would push to get the strange pancakes tested. A group of scientists from Northwestern and the Air Force's Technical Intelligence Center analyzed them. The group would discover them to be made of elements of this planet. More specifically, the pancakes were made of flour, sugar, and grease. The Air Force would investigate the other aspects of the case and conclude the following. Simonton answered questions directly, did not contradict himself, insisted on the facts being exactly as he stated, and refused to accept embellishments or modifications. He stated he was sure that we wouldn't believe him, but he didn't care whether he was believed. He stated simply that this happened, and that was that. Interestingly, the report also stated the only flaw is the disappearance of the craft in 2 seconds. This is really odd for a number of reasons, most notably because in so many cases witnesses report seeing craft flying off at incredible speeds. Sometimes they fly so fast that some witnesses report the craft disappearing into thin air. Other Air Force personnel would investigate Joe as well. Some believed him, while others thought he may have hallucinated the event due to an injury. One interesting theory comes from Lloyd Mallon, who wrote a book titled The UFO Handbook for Air Force Personnel. Mallon stated the Air Force investigated one popular rumor that swirled in the community that was published by Raymond Palmer, the publisher of Pulp Flying Saucer and several other science fiction magazines. Palmer wrote that Joe was hypnotized by someone who was hired by a local real estate agent and given the pancake story. This was done so he would repeat it and be able to bypass any sort of lie detector. The hope from the real estate agent, according to the rumor, was that it would draw attention to the area and boost business. Still, most look past Palmer's theory due to the reputation of Palmer. Palmer was considered somewhat of a nut job even in UFO circles. For example, one of Palmer's beliefs was that UFOs came from a secret Hollow Earth civilization ruled by a race called detrimental robots, which he called Deros. Palmer believed the Deros manipulated humanity with some sort of rays he called thought rays. Palmer was said to have only one source for his theory, and it came from the memory of a Pennsylvania welder. While there weren't any other witnesses that saw what Joe saw, one interesting account comes from someone in the area. About the same time Joe was visited, a local insurance agent named Savino Borgo was driving along Highway 70 about a mile from Joe's farm. According to Borgo, he saw what he later described as a flying saucer rising diagonally into the air and flying parallel with the highway. What can we make of the Joe Simonton case? By all accounts, Joe appeared to be very credible and also told the story in a consistent manner. He was interrogated by not only military officials, but also local police, many who knew Joe for decades and said they believed him and that he was also very reliable. The story of Joe Simonton is surely an interesting one for a number of reasons. First and foremost are the pancakes he was given. While they appear to be of terrestrial origin and made from ordinary ingredients, that's not definite proof that this encounter didn't happen. Joe kept the pancakes, and if he did try and fabricate the encounter, why would he send them off so they could be tested? The pancakes seem to support the theory these beings were biological in nature just like us, needing energy. This leads to the next strange aspect of this case, the water jug. Why would the beings need such a small amount of water, and couldn't they get this water themselves? As many have joked on the case, maybe the pancake batter was too thick. Cases where beings need water, though, are not unheard of. On this channel, we covered a close encounter of the third kind, called the Udo Wartina case. In that case, the witness reported the craft landed next to a river, and several hoses came out of the ship, sucking up the water. It's not clear why they needed the water, though. One other intriguing aspect of this case is the beings. Usually when people report encounters with aliens that are human-like, they're Nordics. Nordics have blonde hair, blue eyes, are tall, and are known for being physically attractive. These beings, though, Joe described as Italian-looking. This is not something seen that often. The encounter itself seemed to be amicable, although some have stated they believe the pancake was actually some sort of scientific experiment. Did it contain some sort of ingredients that were put in Joe's system to track him? Many don't think so, as they believe they wouldn't actually need to do this. While the most popular theory is that this was ETs, some have suggested this was a military experiment. The beings appeared human, but not Nordics. Also, the pancake ingredients were of this planet. Perhaps the military was testing something with the pancake. In general, this case surely is an odd one, but one that surely deserves attention. Unfortunately, there was only one witness to the event, although he sure seems credible. It said Joe had more encounters after this, which isn't that unusual. Unfortunately, the attention and constant harassment from his story seemed to deter him from reporting more encounters. In Potosí, Bolivia, 1968, one of the most famous alien encounters in the country's history would occur. The story concerns a young woman witnessing a strange entity mutilating her sheep and ultimately having an altercation with the bizarre being. The case truly stands out as a mild-mannered peasant brawled with an extraterrestrial. There's not many cases of humans fighting with aliens, as often witnesses are terrified beyond belief and choose to flee. For this young woman, though, when her fight-or-flight response kicked in, she clearly chose to fight. Despite this, even 30 years after the event, when interviewed, the woman was still terrified of what happened to her that day. In this episode, we will examine this strange and classic Bolivian story, a case that came to be known as the Potosí Sheep Slayer. Just outside Opoco, Bolivia, in the late 1960s, Valentina Flores, then 24 years old, and her husband, Gumercindo, were living a humble lifestyle. The two Quechua Indians were focused on tending to their livestock and raising their infant child, Theodosia. The two lived an isolated life with little contact with the outside world. As such, the two had no familiarity nor interest with extraterrestrials and UFOs, and were focused on making a living with their livestock. Sometime after Easter in 1968, Valentina would have an experience she would never forget. That day, her husband, Guerra, like all the men in the area, had been mandated to go to Las Pampas. Valentina was alone, along with Theodosia. Around 4 p.m., Valentina, with Theodosia strapped to her back in a manta, began herding her flock of sheep, only to discover some llama were missing. She herded the sheep into a grazing field and then went listening for the missing llamas. Valentina began tracking them, and after around 45 minutes, caught up with them. She started directing them back to the grazing field, but when she arrived, the sheep had ran off. She left the llamas behind and soon tracked the sheep to a stone corral. From a distance, she couldn't make out many details yet, but she was perplexed as to why they went in there. Even more strange, it was quiet, very quiet. As Valentina approached, what she saw next would leave her stunned. There was some sort of web-like transparent covering over the corral. She couldn't see everything inside it though, and soon silently crept up to see what was going on. As she looked through the opening in the corral, Valentina would be stunned to see sheep corpses everywhere. They were disemboweled and slaughtered in a horrifying fashion. Even worse, there was something inside the corral murdering them. The being was around 3 to 4 feet tall, and butchering the sheep with some sort of device with a razor-sharp hook. It appeared to be attached to a chain. The being was on one knee at this time, and was wearing strange clothing like a wetsuit. It had brown boots, red straps that covered the chest in an X shape, and appeared to support some type of backpack. It was wearing a helmet with a propeller on top. Valentina could see its face. The being had white, pale skin, blonde hair, blue eyes, and a bright red mustache. Valentina was furious when she saw the entity killing her sheep and lambs. This was her family's livelihood. She began throwing rocks at the entity and yelling at it. The being then stood up in shock and jumped over to a strange device. He started winding it, and the elastic webbing rolled into the device. At this point, Valentina would spot a second entity inside the corral. The second being ran out and then up a hill on the outside. The entity sat on some sort of chair, and then it soon took off into the sky. Valentina, furious at this point, was then left with just the one being. She walked in the corral surrounded by sheep's corpses and walked toward the creature. The being began talking to Valentina in an unknown language, but Valentina wasn't interested. Furious, she grabbed her club and struck it right in the head. Blood spattered, and the entity screamed. The entity at this point began to realize it needed to defend itself. It grabbed the hooked object it used for slaughtering the sheep and threw it at Valentina's chest. The sharp blade landed right into her manta's thick knot, effectively saving her life. A chain then pulled the blade back to the being, and a fearless Valentina refused to back down. She ran at the entity and hit it in the arm with her stick. Once again it bled, but this time it decided not to strike back. It grabbed the mechanical box and ran off, soon disappearing into the sky. Valentina would notify her husband soon and the local officials. Soon after that, the Bolivian army arrived and began investigating. There were sheep carcasses everywhere, at least 60. The bodies were missing internal and external organs, and even more strange, most or all of the blood appeared to be drained from many of the corpses. Although there is no proof, there is a belief that the Bolivian government collected the alien blood at the scene, and somewhere this blood is still stored. The Bolivian military would canvass the area and soon question other ranchers and farmers in the region. They would soon learn that during this time, many ranchers had experienced strange activity. For example, several stated they had found mutilated corpses drained of the blood and also seen odd beings running out of the corrals. Due to their livelihood gone, Valentina and her family would be forced to move south. In 2001, UFO investigator J.J. Benitez traveled to Bolivia to interview Valentina. She would relay the story to him. Perhaps the most interesting detail of the case was that Valentina was unfamiliar with extraterrestrials and UFOs. Although frightened, she didn't seem to make the connection. What can we make of this case? It's odd to say the least, and there are several things that seem to support it. One is that it doesn't appear the witness was fabricating the story. By all accounts, she seems to be credible. Also, there are questions as to why she would do this. For example, why would she slaughter 60 of her sheep and her family's livelihood? In addition, many others reported strange similar activity at the time of the incident, and it was investigated by the military. It appears to be such a strange story, it almost feels like this one couldn't be made up. Despite this, many critics say the case is flimsy. There was only one eyewitness, and some question whether a peasant woman carrying a newborn would viciously attack an unknown creature, especially one with a weapon. Could it be the case the family needed to abandon their lives for some reason? We know it couldn't be to collect an insurance payout, as no one, or the majority of ranchers, didn't have insurance back then for their livestock. Her motivation doesn't appear to be financial in any way. Still, perhaps Valentina was tired of the secluded life and just wanted to leave the isolation. This raises the question around the internal and external organs. Would she really have had the time to butcher 60 sheep and also remove all the organs? It seems far-fetched to think she would do this. One thing this case has going for it, though, is the livestock mutilations. Mutilations are still reported today and are quite common. Often strange activity occurs before and after them. There's cases of cows and other livestock being abducted, and even reports of abductees seeing them on crafts. While we may never know the truth about this event, this case has become quite popular, not only in Bolivia, but around the world. On the afternoon of September 4th, 1964, Donald Schramm set out on a hunting adventure with friends in Cisco Grove, California. Cisco Grove is a small community that resides in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountain range in the Tahoe National Forest. Donald was an experienced hunter, and the group planned on hunting deer only with bow and arrow. In the early afternoon, the group separated and spread out in the woods, planning to meet back at the campsite before it fell dark. As the afternoon progressed, Donald would go way off course, searching for a deer. Little did he know that he had gone quite astray. As nighttime fell, he was far from base camp and decided to spend the night in a tree in order to avoid predators. That night, a predator did come, but it was unlike anything he could have ever imagined. In this episode, we will examine Donald Schramm's 1964 strange and terrifying alien encounter. On the night of September 4th, 1964, armed with just a bow and arrow, 26-year-old Donald Schramm scaled a tree with the intention of sleeping the night there and heading back to camp once daytime arrived. Donald hadn't spotted any deer earlier in that day, which he thought was somewhat strange. As he sat, buckled to the tree, Donald would notice a white light soon hovering above them. It was zigzagging at a low altitude just over the treetops. Initially, Donald believed that it was a rescue helicopter and that his friends, concerned he hadn't returned to camp, reported him missing. Donald decided to try and draw attention to the white light by lighting a flare. After several flares, the white light drastically turned and started heading toward him. He climbed down the tree, and the craft stopped around 50 yards from the tree. Donald realized then it was making no noise, and this was not a helicopter. He quickly ascended the tree in order to hide. The craft was big, around 150 feet long, dark-colored and cigar-shaped. A portal opened up on it, and a smaller, silver-colored craft descended to the trees. Donald remained as still as possible in the tree, attempting to stay hidden. After around 5 minutes, he saw two beings walking through the woods. They wore tight silver suits, were around 45 feet tall, and humanoid. They began collecting soil samples, and Donald, who was around 15 feet in the air, remained hidden. Then, as the beings were walking away from him, accidentally Donald moved in the tree. Some twigs snapped, and the beings heard the noise. They turned around, looked upward, and spotted Donald. They made some type of strange noise, and soon Donald would hear a third being approach. This one was different and appeared to be a robot, not biological. The torso was box-shaped, the legs and arms looked made of metal, and the head was square. The robot had red eyes and approached the base of the tree along with the two humanoids. The beings tried shaking the tree to knock Donald down, but were unsuccessful. After this failed, the robot looked up toward Donald, opened its jaws, and a white mist flew out from its mouth. Donald tried his best to avoid the mist, but he inhaled it, and it paralyzed him. In a few moments' time, he passed out, buckled to the tree. He woke up and felt nauseous, and the beings were still down below the tree. As he regained his strength, he shot an arrow directly in the chest of the robot, causing sparks to fly everywhere. The three beings backed off and retreated away from the base of the tree. They then began approaching again, and Donald would shoot another arrow at the robot, striking it once again. At this point, the beings continued to try and attack Donald throughout the night. The robot continued spewing the white vapor, and it knocked Donald out again and again. Each time he awoke, the beings were closer and trying to get him down from the tree. Donald continued to fire arrows. Once he ran out, he started to throw things at the beings. He started lighting his clothing on fire and dropping it on them to discourage them. This fight went on all night. Then, with only a few hours left, Donald was struggling. The beings were still relentlessly attacking, yet he was exhausted. More beings had came and gone throughout the night, and Donald was forced to fend them off by any means necessary. Not only was he exhausted, but with much of his clothing burned, he was freezing. He would pass out once more. Donald then woke up to the sun rising, and the beings were all gone. He scaled down the tree and used his compass to get him back to base camp. He arrived and was exhausted. He told his friends what had happened, and they believed him, as one of the other hunters had seen the larger craft while he was out. Once Donald got home, he told his wife and a few others. Word would reach the Air Force, who came and interviewed Donald. The interview was very secretive, but the agent seemed very interested in the story. Still, nothing came from the matter, and it was closed by the Air Force as something explainable. Donald would suffer from PTSD for years after the event. He was unable to tell his story because he worked at a top-secret missile facility. Regardless, he eventually lost his job due to the stress of the event. Donald decided to tell his story years later. In 2011, he would write a book about his experience. In the book, Aliens in the Woods, the Cisco Grove Encounter. The book details the 12-hour fight that endured between him and the aliens. Still, it's important to point out that prior to Donald publishing the book, this case was investigated by several ufologists who deemed Donald to be credible. In addition, they verified the other hunter spotted the craft that night as well. This helps the credibility of the case, although there are certainly some questionable aspects. First, there was only one witness to the fight. A second weakness concerns the behavior of the beings and the story in general. For example, how are advanced beings unable to knock down a tree? This is an interesting question, and it's tough to imagine with advanced technology they couldn't knock it down. It could be the case, though, they weren't familiar with the material. They were collecting evidence of the soil and the surrounding area in tubes. In addition, it might be they needed him alive or wanted him alive, and they thought cutting down the tree might kill him. Another criticism has to do with the fight itself. It's tough to imagine they couldn't have taken Donald. We've seen many alien abduction cases where the beings come in locked homes. In most alien abduction cases, the beings are able to take the abductees with little effort. Once again, though, their mindset might have stopped them from doing this. They almost surely wanted to get Donald alive. Donald, by all accounts, has been said to be a credible individual. His story was somewhat backed up by another witness seeing the craft. While we'll never know for sure what happened that day, this is surely a fascinating story that might give one pause before heading out into the woods. From time to time, we cover cases on this channel where individuals allege to have sexual relations with extraterrestrials. These cases, although difficult to believe and sometimes humorous, are ones that have led to numerous theories on the being's intentions. In this episode, we will dive into a little-known alien abduction from Texas, an incident that has come to be known as the Alvin Guerra alien abduction. In February 1982, in Mercury, Texas, a man named Alvin Guerra had just laid down to go to sleep when he would have an experience that would change his life forever. As Alvin was just about to fall asleep, he would spot a bright blue light shining in from outside. Alvin got up and, curious, decided to walk out to his patio and see where the light was coming from. As he stepped outside, he would spot a massive 75-foot dark gray craft hovering silently above. The craft blended in with the night sky for the most part, but did have 3 large rocket-type devices underneath it. Alvin would later describe the craft as being stealth-like. Then, on his patio, Alvin would hear a woman's voice call out to him.
"Don't be afraid. Cooperate, and we won't hurt you."
Alvin didn't see anyone initially, but then spotted a silhouette of someone. The person began approaching him, and as it stepped into the light, he could see a gorgeous tall blonde woman. She was around 6 feet, 2 inches tall, and had green piercing eyes. Her skin was quite pale, and she was wearing blue coveralls. The being had a strange emblem on the left side of her chest area. It was a short, narrow stripe, light blue color. Right above it was a darker blue stripe, the same size. A dark blue circle appeared beneath the 2 stripes. This is an interesting detail we will discuss more later in the video. Next, the woman would state once again,
"Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid."
She extended her hand, and as she made contact, a blue mist began to engulf the two. Alvin blinked, and the next thing he knew, he was inside the craft. The woman then told Alvin to follow him for a tour of the craft. As he walked through it, he noticed the walls were made of the same material as the outside of the UFO. Alvin then entered a room where he saw boxes resembling coffins. All the boxes were opened and empty. the being would tell Alvin that they went inside the boxes and rejuvenated for several hours each day. Alvin would move on into the next room, which was the cockpit. In there, he would see a larger version of the symbol that was on the woman's suit. 5 women were in the room working, and they would all smile at him. The women or beings were all similar in appearance, looking much like the first woman he met. Next, Alvin would then walk down another hall, and he would spot a room where 3 more women were working on some type of control device. One of the beings was extremely tall, being at least 6 feet 8 inches. He was then taken to a medical room. It was filled with around 20 beings, all appearing as women, and all very tall, around 6 feet 6 inches. Most of the beings were experimenting on animals and birds. One of the beings, though, approached Alvin and asked him to lay down on a medical table. The being was holding a dark blue colored laser and began shining it on him. The device would draw blood up from his skin. As he was laying back on the table, he would see a green screen above him. It's not clear what the screen was for exactly, but presumably it was some other type of screen used in medical testing. To Alvin's left, there was another black screen on the wall where he could see a holographic image of his body appear. After the test, he continued his tour with the original being who greeted him. At the end of the tour, Alvin would be escorted into a room, and there, according to Alvin, him and the being would have intercourse. Sometime during this, Alvin stated that he lost consciousness. He woke back up in his bed, naked, and would also discover his necklace, which he never took off, was missing. What can we make of this incredible story? At first hand, this surely seems like a dream, or perhaps one man's strange fantasy. However, before discussing the sexual relations claim, there are some things that he mentioned that we see time and time again from close encounter reports. First, the description of the beings is very typical, with the aliens appearing as Nordic beings. It is interesting, though, that Alvin reported seeing only female and that many of the beings were so tall. Usually, when Nordic beings, both men and women, are seen, they're reported to be around 6 feet tall. One interesting aspect of the case has to do with the emblem he saw. Alvin reported a symbol on the blue coveralls of 2 stripes with a circle below it. For comparison, in both the Filiberto Cardina case and the Herbert Schirmer incident, both witnesses reported the beings had some sort of serpent emblem on their chest. We covered both these cases, and viewers have pointed out this characteristic has been seen in other cases too. The final aspect of the case that seems to add credibility is that Alvin woke up naked after going to bed in pajamas and that his necklace was taken. Some will argue that Alvin could have sleptwalked and actually took off his clothes and ripped his necklace off himself. Some will say he could have also simply just lied. Cases of individuals alleging sexual encounters are not unheard of, though. On this channel we've covered a number of cases. In the Meng Zhagoa case, one of China's most famous alien abductions, Meng alleged to have sex with a 10-foot tall, 6-fingered alien woman for 40 minutes before the alien then disappeared through his wall. In the Antonio Villas Boas case, Antonio alleged to have sex with an extremely attractive alien with cat-like eyes. After they finished, the being smiled, rubbed her belly, and pointed toward the sky, indicating that they would have a baby together. The case of Alvin was published in the book Sexual Encounters with Extraterrestrials by C.L. Turnage. There are several theories as to why these beings might want to mate with humans. The most popular is that the offspring produces some type of hybrid being, possibly one that could blend into society. Many allege these hybrid beings walk among us, and have for quite some time. Another theory is curiosity and understanding our reproductive process. However, many scoff at this theory, as it seems like the beings would be able to figure this out another way. Some simply state most of these stories are created and are not true, or perhaps are lucid dreams. Still, we know that many have reported being taken from their homes, often floating through solid objects like closed windows and the roof. Often the similarities between the stories is remarkable. In some, it seems like these beings are capable of many extraordinary things, and many times the stories from those who communicate with them don't make much sense. That said, even if Alvin's story was fabricated or imagined, much of the phenomena is not well understood, and it's probably worth hearing out these far-fetched stories.